The man known to history as Gamal Abdel Nasser was born on the 15th of January 1918 in the Bakos district of Alexandria in Egypt. His father, Abdel Nasser Hussein, was from a lower middle-class family that owned land in the village of Beni Mur, near the city of Asyut in Upper Egypt. At this time, the Egyptian middle class constituted a small section of society distinct from the pashas of Turkish origin who owned most of the land and the millions of peasants who farmed it as tenants. Abdel had studied at the American Missionary School in Asyut before joining the postal service in Alexandria in 1908, where in 1917 he married Gamal's mother, Fahima Mohammed Hamad. Fahima was the daughter of a coal merchant. After marrying, she had 4 sons. Gamal was the eldest. He was very close to her and was devastated by her death in 1926 while giving birth to her 4th child. Gamal was living in Cairo with his paternal uncle Khalil at the time of his mother's death and did not learn about it until several months later. Abdel's decision to remarry in 1928 created distance between Gamal and his father. Gamal grew up during a period of considerable instability in Egypt. For centuries, the country had been part of the Ottoman Empire, which ruled the Middle East and the Balkans from Constantinople, now Istanbul. Yet, with the decline of Ottoman power in the 18th century, Egypt had become increasingly autonomous. European influence increased here following the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. However, although the French had been the driving force behind the Suez Initiative, it was the British who effectively established control in all but name over Egypt in the 1870s, as they sought to protect the new sea route to British India, the crown of their empire. Eventually, when the Ottoman Empire entered the First World War against Britain, Egypt's status was upgraded to a British protectorate. Yet while the war had seen British control of Egypt made starkly clear, it also had seen the general rise of Arab and Muslim nationalism across the Middle East and into North Africa. Consequently, in 1919, the Egyptian nationalist leader Saad Zaghlol led the Egyptian Revolution as Egyptian nationalists called for independence from Britain. The British initially tried to resist these efforts and exiled Zaghlol to the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean, but eventually the government gave in to demands for greater autonomy and established the independent Kingdom of Egypt, with the Sultan becoming King Fuad I. Zaghlol was allowed to return from exile in 1923, and his Wafd party won a landslide in national elections the following year. Nevertheless, while there was a veneer of independence after being granted to Egypt, British oversight of affairs in the country remained great, and troops remained stationed here as London continued to protect its vital interests in Cairo and over the Suez Canal. During these tumultuous years in Egyptian politics, Nasser's father Abdel was constantly transferred from place to place for his work with the postal service. Gamal tended to follow his family around, moving to Asyut at the age of 3 and to Hatatba, north of Cairo, a couple of years later. Between the ages of 7 and 9, Gamal spent 3 years in Cairo, studying at the El Nahassin Elementary School, where he lived with his uncle Khalil, a civil servant. The young Gamal enjoyed exploring the district around the Al-Azhar University and was an outstanding student at school. In 1929, he attended a private boarding school in Helwan in southern Cairo, before returning to Alexandria to rejoin his father, who had been posted back to the Mediterranean port city. While studying at the Ras El Tin High School in Alexandria in 1930, Nasser joined a student demonstration in Manshia Square without knowing what it was about. After being arrested by police, Nasser learned that the protest had been organized by the Nationalist Young Egypt Society, protesting against the Egyptian government's annulment of the 1923 constitution to reduce the power of parliament. After spending a night in prison and being bailed out by his father, Nasser gradually became more politically conscious in opposition to British rule in Egypt. In 1933, Gamal moved to Cairo with his family and went to the El Nada school, where he became head of the student union. Living in close proximity to the National Library, he spent his spare time reading the biographies of historical figures that had impacted on Egyptian history. People like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, and Lawrence of Arabia. He was also interested in the lives of revolutionary leaders and nation builders, such as Otto von Bismarck and Giuseppe Garibaldi, the two figures who had unified Germany and Italy in the middle of the 19th century. The young Nasser was also heavily influenced by Mustafa Kamil, the anti-British lawyer and journalist who founded the Egyptian Nationalist Party, and Ahmed Shawki, considered to be the greatest Arab poet of the day. Another key influence was Tawfiq al-Hakim, a writer whose first novel, Return of the Spirit, was published in 1933 and called for a charismatic leader to guide the Egyptian people to freedom from European colonialism. While Nasser was an introverted and sensitive teenager, he and his fellow students shared a sense of injustice at both the continuing interference of Britain in Egyptian politics and society and the unequal wealth of the feudal elites in Cairo. In 1935, he wrote to his closest friend, Hassan al-Nashar, "They say the Egyptian is a coward, that he is afraid of the slightest sound. He needs a leader to lead him in the struggle for his country." By this means, this same Egyptian would become a thunderclap, which would make the walls of tyranny tremble. Clearly, even as a boy in his late teens, Nasser was already highly politically conscious. In 1935 and 1936, demonstrations broke out over the country, demanding the restoration of the 1923 Constitution. The popular political movements at the time included the Muslim Brotherhood, which urged Egyptians to turn away from foreign influences and to return to Islam as a guide for social and political order. The fascist-inspired Young Egypt movement, also known as the Green Shirts and the Blue Shirts of the Wafd Party, but while Nasser flirted with all these movements, he does not appear to have joined any of them. On the 9th of November 1935, Nasser led a student protest in Cairo after British Foreign Secretary Sir Samuel Hoare refused to reinstate the 1923 Constitution. Nasser was shot by police and was mentioned in the nationalist Al-Jihad newspaper the following day. On the 12th of November, King Fouad responded to popular pressure and reinstated the 1923 Constitution. The demonstrations against British rule continued into 1936, and Nasser dedicated most of his time to political activities, attending school for only 45 days during his final year at El Nada. In April 1936, King Fouad I died and was succeeded by his son King Farouk I, who was welcomed as a more liberal ruler. Shortly afterwards, in August 1936, the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty was signed, which gave Egypt greater control over its foreign policy and led to the country joining the League of Nations in 1937. Nasser was opposed to the treaty on the basis that it allowed for a continued British military presence in Egypt, including 10,000 troops to protect the Suez Canal. Meanwhile, he hoped to go to the military academy after leaving school, but his initial application in 1936 was rejected owing to his lack of social connections and his previous involvement in student protests. Unperturbed, he applied again before long, this time petitioning the Under-Secretary of War, General Ibrahim Hairi, who looked favorably on the zealous young man's case. Nasser was accepted into the academy in March 1937. During his 17 months at the academy, Nasser met Abdel Hakim Amer and Anwar Sadat, both of whom became close friends of his and whose paths would be intrinsically entwined for many years to come. Nasser excelled in his studies in administration and graduated quickly in 1938 as a second lieutenant. His first posting was in Mankabad, not far from his ancestral home of Beni Mer. before being posted in the early 1940s to Khartoum in Sudan, accompanied by Amer. Nasser's posting to Sudan was a result of the shifting politics and military situation in Europe and how it was impacting on Africa. War had broken out between Britain and Germany in September 1939, and in the summer of 1940, Italy had joined the Second World War with the Germans. This brought the fighting to Africa, where Italy had colonies both to the west of Britain's position in Egypt and to the south in the Horn of Africa. It was in an effort to shore up the southern border of Egypt and the Sudan that officers and soldiers like Nasser were sent to Khartoum in the early 1940s. Eventually, though, with a German expeditionary force, the Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, arriving in Libya in late 1941, Nasser was sent north again. These developments also involved Britain reasserting nearly full control over Egypt, and King Farouk was revealed as little more than a puppet ruler in 1941 and 1942, something which deeply troubled Nasser and other officers of a nationalist bent in the Egyptian military. Nasser's close friend Anwar Sadat had even attempted to join Rommel's forces but was arrested. These developments dealt a fatal blow to King Farouk, who was already increasingly unpopular amongst his subjects. In tandem, the Muslim Brotherhood and Young Egypt movement gained popularity at the expense of Wafd, which never regained its dominant role in Egyptian politics. In late 1942, General Bernard Montgomery defeated Rommel at the Battle of El Alamein, decisively shifting momentum in the Allies' favor in North Africa. In the meantime, Nasser was promoted to captain and entered the Staff College, where he remained in close contact with Amer and also befriended Khalid Mohiaddin, a left-wing officer and member of the Communist Party. Both men had contacts with the Muslim Brotherhood but continued to keep their distance due to ideological differences. In early 1943, Nasser was appointed an instructor at the academy. On the 29th of June 1944, he married Tahir Mohammed Kazim, the daughter of an Iranian rug merchant, whose brother Abdel Hamid was a friend of Nasser's. Tahir was a highly educated woman, fluent in English and French. The couple moved into a house in the Cairo suburbs, where they would have two daughters, Hoda and Mona, followed by three sons, Khalid, Abdel Hamid, and Abdel Hakim. Not only did Tahir manage the household and bring up the children, she would also help him in his political aspirations. While Nasser would fight many stressful political battles in his life, his family life remained a source of stability and happiness for him. In 1944, the Arab League was founded, with its headquarters in Cairo, as an association which would further pan-Arab goals after the war. Many in Egypt viewed it as a means to fully end British rule in the country once and for all, once the war ended in 1945. Another pan-Arab goal concerned the situation in Palestine, a region which had been under British supervision since the end of the First World War. In November 1947, the newly formed United Nations adopted a resolution to partition British Palestine between the Palestinian Arabs and the proposed Jewish state of Israel. Neighboring Arab states, including Jordan and Egypt, were opposed to the creation of an independent Jewish state on their frontiers. When the Jewish leaders in Palestine declared the creation of an independent state of Israel, King Farouk responded by sending his army against the Israelis in May 1948, after the withdrawal of British troops from the region. In this military campaign, Nasser was attached to the 6th Infantry Battalion as a staff officer. On the 12th of July, he was lightly wounded, and by August his brigade was trapped in the village of Al-Fallujah near Gaza, surrounded by Israeli forces. Appeals for help from fellow Egyptian soldiers and Arab allies were rejected, but Nasser continued to hold out. In February 1949, Nasser joined the Egyptian delegation to sign the UN-brokered armistice with Israel, which recognized the Egyptian occupation of the Gaza Strip an arrangement that fell considerably short of Egyptian objectives for the war. After returning to Cairo in March, Nasser was inspired by events in Syria, where the military officer Husni al-Zaim had overthrown the government. With Amer as his close ally, Nasser now began to recruit officers to stage a similar coup in Egypt when possible. This led in the late 1940s to the formation of the Association of Free Officers, of which Nasser was elected as chairman. The group included Abdel Hakim Amer, Anwar Sadat, and Khalid Mohiuddin, and its members had ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, Young Egypt, and the Communists. Given the diversity of opinion among the free officers, the organization limited its initial goals to ending British influence in Egypt and reforming the corrupt government. In January 1950, while the Muslim Brotherhood boycotted elections, the Wafd Party returned to government on a platform similar to that of the free officers. The situation threatened the free officers' purpose, but the organization was far from being prepared to overthrow the government. In October 1951, Prime Minister Nahar's decision to discard the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty led to popular demonstrations in the Suez Canal zone against the British military presence there. Meanwhile, there was a growing conflict developing between King Farouk and the Officers' Club, with Nasser pushing for the candidacy of General Mohammed Naguib, a decorated war hero, to senior position within the government, to be promoted, a point of contention between the Crown and officers like Nasser. The growing tensions came to a head in July 1952, when Nasser learned that the king had a list of the names of the members of the Association of Free Officers and was planning to arrest them. Nasser responded by rushing to launch a coup and take control of the country. Yet, as a relatively junior lieutenant colonel, he knew that he himself would not be accepted as the leader of the coup. Therefore, he recruited General Mohammed Naguib as its figurehead. A couple of days in advance of the operation, Nasser also informed the Muslim Brotherhood and the Communists of his plans and gained their support. What is now known as the Egyptian Revolution was carried out on the 23rd of July 1952. The operation began as prominent free officers led their men to seize strategic points of communication and army headquarters. That morning, Anwar Sadat also addressed a proclamation in Naguib's name announcing the creation of the Revolutionary Command Council, or RCC in short, with Naguib as chairman and Nasser as vice chairman. After this initial seizure of power, Nasser contacted the king through intermediaries and demanded his abdication. Hence, on the 25th of July, a delegation went to Alexandria to see Farouk off, as he left Egypt and went into exile, leaving his 7-month-old son as King Fuad II, a mere figurehead for the new military regime. In September 1952, Nasser founded Liberation Rally, a political organization intended to promote the activities of the RCC, with himself as Secretary General. The goal was to further Nasser's own political agenda, as the loose coalition that he and the military officers had built up with the Muslim Brotherhood and the Communists in order to seize power had collapsed soon after the Egyptian Revolution, as their ideological differences became clear. The new movement soon led to clashes within the fragile regime, which had been established the previous year. For instance, when Nasser and the RCC proposed abolishing political parties apart from Liberation Rally in January 1953, Naguib signaled his opposition. Despite this growing rivalry between Nasser and Naguib, the pair did agree to formally abolish the monarchy, and on the 18th of June 1953, Naguib proclaimed the creation of the Republic of Egypt, with Naguib as its first president, and Nasser serving as Minister of the Interior and Deputy Prime Minister. Before long, Nasser moved to undermine his rival. In February 1954, he had Naguib kidnapped, and while he was under detention, Nasser had his long-standing political ally and friend, Abdel Hakim Amer, appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the army, and became Prime Minister himself. He eventually forced Naguib from the office of president altogether in November 1954, in the aftermath of an assassination attempt against Nasser on the 26th of October, orchestrated by the Muslim Brotherhood. With Naguib fully removed, Nasser now became the de facto military dictator of Egypt. In less than a decade, Nasser had emerged from obscurity as a mid-ranking military commander at the end of the Second World War to first lead the Egyptian Revolution and then to seize power himself shortly afterwards. Not content with this, in the years that followed, he would seek to establish himself as a pan-Arab leader in the Middle East and North Africa, a new kind of ruler, free from the trappings of monarchy and committed to a form of socialism. As such, he championed land reform after claiming power in 1954, while his desire to be seen as an Arab leader was seen in the establishment of the Voice of the Arabs radio station to spread his anti-colonial and Arab nationalist message. At the same time, he was receiving petitions from the British Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, who would succeed Winston Churchill as Prime Minister 2 months later, about joining the Baghdad Pact, a proposed agreement between Middle Eastern states and the United Kingdom designed to pull several Muslim countries into the Western, US-led sphere in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Demonstrating his antipathy towards the Western powers, Nasser refused to join and discouraged other Arab states from doing so as well. In the end, the Baghdad Pact included only 5 members: the United Kingdom, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan and Turkey. Instead, in April 1955, Nasser attended the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, alongside the host President Sukarno, Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Yugoslavia's dictator Josip Tito, and Premier Zhou Enlai of the Communist People's Republic of China. The 37-year-old Nasser enhanced his international prestige and emerged as one of the main actors in the conference, after which Egypt joined Indonesia, India and Yugoslavia in declaring neutrality in the Cold War, an association which would become known as the Non-Aligned Movement in 1961. Parties to this sought to maintain relations with both the Soviet bloc and the West without committing to an alliance with either. In this environment, Nasser asked the Soviet Union for weapons to defend against Israeli raids on Gaza and the Egyptian border. The Soviets agreed and instructed Communist Czechoslovakia to front the deal in order to make it appear that the weapons were not coming directly from Russia. The agreement explicitly undermined the Baghdad Pact, and while the Americans sought through diplomatic channels to encourage Nasser to cancel it, it was concluded in September 1955. After taking power in 1952, Nasser and his colleagues in the Revolutionary Command Council decided to give themselves 3 years to consolidate control of the country before setting up parliamentary institutions. In January 1956, a new constitution was published, which established a National Assembly of 350 members. However, this was as part of a single-party system under the Liberation Rally, and Nasser had no intention of relinquishing power in free and fair elections. Following a referendum in June 1956, the constitution was passed and Nasser became president of Egypt, while the RCC was dissolved as part of the transition to civilian rule. Yet, as significant as these events were, Nasser was not wholly secure in his position when looked at from the international perspective. The Israelis feared the prospect of Nasser uniting the Arabs in another war against Israel. The British and French were threatened by his anti-colonial rhetoric and his support for Algerian rebels fighting for their independence from France, while the Americans hoped to stop his drift towards the Soviet camp. In 1956, Nasser's relationship with the Western world entered a major crisis. During the mid-1950s, as the Revolutionary Command Council was governing Egypt, Nasser and his allies in government had decided on a new infrastructure project that would transform the Egyptian economy. This was to build one of the world's largest dams across the River Nile at Aswan. The project would serve the purpose of bringing the Nile under greater human control in terms of its annual flooding, and also as a hydroelectric project, in the process of transforming both the nature of Egyptian agriculture and producing a huge new source of electricity to power the country's planned industrialization. The Aswan Dam project had secured foreign financing in the mid-1950s, but Nasser's decision to recognize the communist regime in China in May 1956, when added with the arms deal with the Soviet Union the previous year, and continued clashes with Israel along the border, led the US to withdraw its financing for the Aswan scheme, followed by Britain and the World Bank. In retaliation, Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company, which was still primarily owned and managed by British and French shareholders, in July 1956. Shortly afterwards, Egyptian military units moved to take control of the canal, which had remained largely under European control even after the Egyptian Revolution. This triggered the Suez Crisis. Nasser's nationalization of the company, in the name of the people, was greeted enthusiastically in Egypt and throughout the Arab world, but with fury in Europe's capital cities. Britain, France, Israel, and the United States now considered what steps to take in response. When the pro-British Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri Saeed heard the news, he was in London and sought a meeting with Anthony Eden to discuss how to deal with Nasser, advising the British Prime Minister to hit him hard, and hit him now. Despite US President Eisenhower's efforts to avoid war, Eden was inclined towards Saeed's thinking and sought authorization from his cabinet to use force against Nasser. He rejected American appeals to seek international arbitration, knowing that Nasser had the legal right to nationalize the company, but regarding it as a clear attack on Britain's national interests and prestige. He justified British actions to the world on the basis that the Egyptians would not have the technical capabilities of managing one of the world's most important waterways, and that Nasser's actions would have implications for world trade. Nasser's own propaganda, which was spread through the radio channel Voice of the Arabs, attacked the British repeatedly, while trying not to provoke the Americans. At the UN Security Council, the Soviet Union supported Nasser, the British and French were against him, while the United States opposed military action. This ensured that Britain and France needed to act on their own without UN or US approval. In a matter of weeks, a joint British, French, and Israeli plan had been devised to invade Egypt and reclaim control of the canal, and with it much of the Sinai Peninsula. The combined military action began on the 29th of October 1956, when Israeli forces descended on the Sinai Peninsula east of the canal, while the British and French bombed Egyptian military facilities. While some of his allies urged him to surrender, Nasser vowed to fight on and formed a people's militia of 400,000 men, which he called the Liberation Army. Knowing that the poorly equipped Egyptian armed forces were outgunned, Nasser ordered the evacuation of Sinai with the intention of fighting a guerrilla war, drawing the enemy into the desert. In tandem, he ordered the evacuation of the Egyptian Air Force to Sudan and Saudi Arabia, before sinking 47 ships to block the canal. When British and French paratroopers began to land at Port Said on the northern end of the canal on the 6th of November, Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin threatened a nuclear strike against the British, French, and Israelis. On the same day, President Eisenhower called for an immediate withdrawal of British, French, and Israeli troops from Egypt. The unequivocal American demand led to a UN ceasefire resolution on the 7th, by which time the Israelis had occupied much of the Sinai Peninsula. While Eisenhower's intervention was decisive, Nasser gained global esteem for facing down the British and French. UN resolutions accepted that the canal belonged to Egypt, and British and French forces withdrew in December. Anthony Eden resigned as Prime Minister on the 9th of January 1957, while the Suez Canal was cleared of the ships and debris and was reopened on the 8th of April, a month before the Israeli occupation forces completed their withdrawal from Egypt. Broadly, the entire incident had been a devastating blow against British national pride in particular, and the Suez Crisis is generally seen as marking the beginning of the end for Britain's empire, with its colonies across Africa acquiring independence in the decade that followed. As such, Nasser played an important part in the decolonization of Africa in the middle of the 20th century. Nasser's performance during the Suez Crisis elevated him to the status of a national hero, and he used his increased reputational standing to push through new economic measures in the late 1950s. In the first 5 years after coming to power, Nasser had largely limited his economic initiatives to land reform, but in 1957 he also began nationalizing the remaining British and French assets in Egypt, though he paid compensation to shareholders. While the state took control of large parts of the economy and set up an economic development organization, for the time being, Nasser stopped short of full nationalization, and 2/3 of Egyptian enterprises remained privately owned. He invested in agriculture and industry, and accepted a $300 million loan from the Soviet Union to build the Aswan Dam and replace the Western financing which had been removed in 1956. As part of his effort towards developing the Egyptian economy, he also expanded access to education and supported technical and vocational schools, while persuading the leaders of Al-Azhar University to modernize their curriculum and begin teaching the sciences. Nasser's popularity was at a peak following the Suez Crisis, not just at home in Egypt, but further afield across the Middle East. But his pan-Arab nationalism was also causing alarm in America. Despite Eisenhower's decisive intervention in the Suez Crisis, the promulgation of the Eisenhower Doctrine in January 1957 pointed towards American commitment to stopping the spread of communism in the Middle East. Although Nasser was no communist, his arms deal with Moscow and acquisition of funding for the Aswan Dam had convinced many in Washington that he was, and the Eisenhower Doctrine was essentially designed to isolate him by establishing American alliances with King Saud of Saudi Arabia, King Hussein of Jordan, and Prime Minister al-Said of Iraq, as British influence in the Middle East was replaced by American influence in the aftermath of Suez. The US also began efforts to support Islamist groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt at this time, in an effort to undermine Nasser. Nasser's pan-Arab approach, one which sought to unify the Arab states in North Africa and the Middle East in common purpose against foreign interferences, experienced mixed fortunes in the years that followed. On the other hand, in 1957, King Hussein of Jordan began moving his country away from Egypt diplomatically, alarmed by the threat which Nasser's popularity posed to his own control over Jordan. Matters were different, though, further to the north in Syria. The country had been highly unstable after French colonial rule ended in 1946, with the radical Ba'ath movement and the communists both vying to undermine the more moderate government. Nasser was soon being pulled into this conflict. In January 1958, a delegation of Syrian army officers flew to Egypt to petition Nasser to support a political union between Egypt and Syria. Nasser was initially reluctant to do so, since Egypt and Syria did not share a border and were separated by Israel and Jordan, but he agreed on the condition that he would have full control over the new combined state. A new National Assembly would be created with 400 Egyptian and 200 Syrian delegates. With this peculiar arrangement in place, on the 1st of February 1958, the United Arab Republic was proclaimed, with Nasser as its president. Later that month, he went to the Syrian capital of Damascus and visited the tomb of Saladin, the Islamic warlord who had led the Muslims during the Third Crusade at the end of the 12th century. In a speech by the tomb, Nasser vowed to follow Saladin's example to realize total Arab unity. The creation of Nasser's United Arab Republic shocked the Arab world, and Nasser's rival, Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Said, now aimed to offset it and protect his own position through a royal union between Iraq and Jordan. However, before any such royal union could be undertaken, the Iraqi monarchical government was overthrown in a military coup, which saw the royal family in Iraq slaughtered. On the same day, having struggled to contain pro-Nasser sentiment in his own country, President Camille Chamoun of Lebanon invoked the Eisenhower Doctrine and US Marines landed in Lebanon. Nasser feared US military invasion, but the election of Fuad Shihab as president of Lebanon in September 1958 eased tensions, and the two sides came to an agreement to resolve their disputes the following March. In the meantime, Nasser sought to incorporate Iraq into the UAR, but the new military regime there was unwilling to do so. In March 1959, Nasser backed an attempted coup by Iraqi officers in Mosul to seize power, as a first step to incorporating Iraq into the United Arab Republic. But the rebellion was put down, and Nasser would have to be content with ruling just Egypt and Syria. Despite his opposition to communism, by the late 1950s, Nasser was using communist methods to manage the economy back in Egypt and Syria. In 1956, he had appointed the young economist Aziz Sidki as Minister of Industry, and Sidki formulated a 5-year plan, announced in 1960, to increase private investment in economic development. In July 1961, Nasser passed a series of decrees to nationalize banks, shipping companies, and heavy industrial enterprises, while other companies were required to sell a controlling stake to the government. Having neutralized the left, Nasser believed that these initiatives would undermine the capitalists and landlords and strengthen his rule in Syria. However, instead, the nationalization decrees triggered a coup on the 28th of September 1961 by a group of army officers who were opposed to the union with Egypt. They seized power in Damascus and quickly declared Syria's independence from Nasser's United Arab Republic. While army units in northern Syria fought to defend the political union with Egypt, and Nasser initially attempted to fight back by landing the Egyptian special forces at the port of Latakia, he decided to recall them within a couple of days, as he was unwilling to shed the blood of fellow Arabs on what seemed like a futile endeavor. Ultimately, the fact that Egypt and Syria were not joined geographically made it impossible to maintain control over Syria from Egypt once a rebellion broke out there. Hence, on the 5th of October, Nasser conceded the secession of Syria and recognized the independence of the new Syrian government, though the United Arab Republic continued to exist as the official name of Egypt until 1971. In the aftermath of the loss of Syria, Nasser embarked on a new wave of economic nationalization at home in Egypt, increasing state ownership in the economy to 51% by 1962. Additionally, Nasser passed a special law confiscating the property of 167 very wealthy individuals and introduced a 90% tax on incomes over 10,000 Egyptian pounds, a relatively low threshold even for the time. Nasser's economic reforms were closely tied to his social policy, and in 1962, Nasser issued a national charter which renamed the National Union to the Arab Socialist Union, reflecting Nasser's pan-Arab and socialist ideologies. The political program included the provision of universal health care, affordable housing, and clean drinking water. As a result of Nasser's policies, the economy grew by 6.5% annually between 1960 and 1965, but economic problems remained, and in 1961, Nasser had to import 200,000 tons of wheat from the United States to feed Egypt. Although the secession of Syria had been a bitter blow to Nasser's pan-Arab ambitions, events in Yemen in 1962 gave him the opportunity to reassert his influence. Between 1958 and 1961, the Kingdom of Yemen, under Imam Ahmad, had been part of a confederation with the United Arab Republic, known as the United Arab States. This had created ties between Egypt, Syria, and Yemen in terms of their collective foreign policy, but did not tie the countries together fully in the way Egypt and Syria were united between 1958 and 1961. In September 1962, Imam Ahmad died and was succeeded by his son Muhammad, but later that month, the new Imam's chief of staff, Abdullah al-Salal, led a coup against him and proclaimed a new Yemen Arab Republic. Nasser duly recognized the new republic, but in early October, Imam Muhammad's royalist forces fought back with support from Saudi Arabia. Nasser sent Egyptian troops to Yemen to support the new government. By 1963, over 15,000 Egyptian soldiers were in the country, and the war continued to rage without any end in sight. His decision to allow the use of chemical weapons during this campaign has damaged Nasser's reputation in the long run. In 1964, Vice President Abdul Latif Baghdadi resigned from office in protest at Nasser's intervention in Yemen, which he later described as Nasser's Vietnam. By 1966, the Egyptian military commitment had increased to 60,000 troops, before Nasser began to realize the futility of remaining in Yemen and ordered a gradual withdrawal. In 1963, Nasser's pan-Arab outlook remained bright. The previous July, the Algerian War had come to an end, with French recognition of Algerian independence, bringing to power Nasser's close ally Ahmed Ben Bella. In February 1963, Nasser's Iraqi rival Abdel Karim Qasim was removed from power and executed by firing squad, following a coup led by the Nasserists and the Iraqi Ba'ath Party, which may have also received the backing of the American Central Intelligence Agency. The new Ba'ath government soon began a brutal crackdown against the communists who had supported Qasim. The Nasserist Abdul Salam Aref, a man who had helped bring Qasim to power 5 years earlier, was installed as president, leading to expectations of an Egyptian-Iraqi union, which would compensate for the loss of the Syrian union 2 years earlier. While the Iraqi government was split on whether to join the Nasser-led union, when the Ba'athists seized power as well in Syria in March, they were clear in their desire to rejoin the UAR with greater autonomy. On the 14th of March, Nasser led talks with the Syrian and Iraqi governments on forming a new union of the 3 states. But his actions scuppered things. He tried to dominate discussions and insisted on being addressed as president by the attendees, while he referred to them by their first names. As a result, while a loose arrangement for union was agreed, there were reservations in Syria and Iraq, then delays, and finally the agreement collapsed. There would be no new United Arab Republic. Nasser's socialist economic reforms and his military intervention in Yemen damaged his political standing in Egypt, and by the mid-1960s his rule was finally being challenged from inside his government. Nasser had willingly handed control over the army to his trusted friend Amer. Left to his own devices, Amer had created his own political power base through his control of the army and the security agencies. In an effort to limit Amer's influence on army personnel, in 1961, Nasser formed a presidential council, which had to approve senior military appointments. The following year, Nasser removed Amer as defense minister in order to take greater control over the army, but removing him entirely was not an option, since he remained popular among both the officer class and the rank and file. As part of his efforts to bolster his domestic position, in March 1964, Nasser introduced a new constitution, which made him supreme commander of the Egyptian army, with Amer as deputy commander. And in March 1965, Nasser was elected to another 6-year term as president. following an election in which no other candidates were allowed to run. The electoral success masked the fact that Nasser's popularity was in decline. Although Nasser managed to celebrate the completion of the first stage of the construction of the Aswan Dam in 1964, his economic policy began to falter. There was a shortage of basic consumer goods, and the country was relying heavily on foreign imports, weakening the balance of trade and increasing government debt. As he attempted to consolidate his hold on power domestically, Nasser continued to be confronted with challenges concerning Israel and his relationship with other Arab leaders. Nasser believed that Arab unity was key to dealing with Israel. In January 1964, having learned that Israel planned to divert the waters of the Jordan River to irrigate the Negev desert, he held a conference of the Arab League in Cairo, during which he sanctioned the creation of the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by the Palestinian diplomat Ahmed al-Shukeri. The PLO had a military wing, the Palestine Liberation Army, which was largely controlled by the states which hosted it, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. While Nasser was keen not to be drawn into war with Israel until the Arabs were ready for war, a younger generation of Palestinian activists who had grown up in refugee camps after the 1948 war were keen to take the fight to Israel and return to their homeland. In the early 1960s, they founded the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, better known as Fatah. By 1965, Fatah fighters were carrying out dozens of raids into Israel, but Nasser and the Arab leaders remained cautious. Following a coup in February 1966, a new Syrian government came to power, calling for a Palestinian liberation war, resulting in increased tensions between Israel and Syria. In early 1967, the Soviet Union warned Nasser of an imminent Israeli invasion of Syria on several occasions, but the Egyptian leader resisted the growing calls for war. In March, the Israelis claimed the right to farm the demilitarized zone separating Israel and Syria, provoking skirmishes between the two sides. After the Israeli Air Force shot down 6 Syrian planes in early April, Nasser fell under increasing pressure from the Arab world to intervene. As the Soviets continued their warnings about an Israeli invasion of Syria, Nasser ordered Egyptian troops to the Sinai Peninsula and requested the withdrawal of UN peacekeeping forces there on the 16th of May 1967, which was granted 2 days later. While Amer proposed a preemptive strike against Israel, Nasser informed both the US and the Soviet Union that he would remain on the defensive. While he continued to have doubts about the abilities of the Egyptian army, by the end of May, Nasser believed that war was inevitable, and on the 23rd, he closed the Straits of Tiran between Sinai and Saudi Arabia to Israeli shipping, effectively shutting Israel off from access to the Red Sea, which the Israelis considered an act of war. On the 30th of May, King Hussein of Jordan arrived in Cairo and joined the alliance with Egypt and Syria, but the decision came too late for the two states to coordinate joint military action before Israel launched an attack. At around 7:30 a.m. on the morning of the 5th of June, the Israeli Air Force launched its attack on Egypt. Abdel Hakim Amer was flying to the front at the time, and Egyptian anti-aircraft gunners had been given instructions not to open fire while he was in the air. As a result, over 300 Egyptian planes were destroyed on the ground within the space of 2 hours. In the meantime, Israeli tanks made huge gains on the ground in Sinai and captured the town of El Arish. The following day, Israeli forces overran the Gaza Strip and were also advancing against the Jordanians in the West Bank, forcing thousands of Palestinian refugees to escape across the Jordan River towards the Jordanian capital of Amman. Nasser went to Amer's headquarters demanding answers, and the two erstwhile friends blamed each other for the disaster. Amer promised Nasser that an Egyptian counter-offensive would push the Israelis back, but in reality many Egyptian officers fled back to Cairo when faced with the Israeli onslaught, allowing the Israelis to occupy the Sinai Peninsula against little opposition. It was not until the 9th of June that Nasser realized how badly the war was going. That evening, he addressed the nation and admitted there had been a major setback. In the meantime, Israel attacked Syria and seized the Golan Heights. By the end of the 10th of June, at the end of what is now known as the Six-Day War, Israeli forces had taken control of the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. During his speech on the 9th of June, Nasser offered his resignation from all his political and military offices and indicated that Vice President Zakaria Mohiuddin would succeed him. Mohiuddin had not been informed of Nasser's intentions beforehand and refused to do so. That night, more than 2 million Egyptians took to the streets, begging Nasser to remain in office, prompting him to withdraw his resignation the following day. On the 11th of June, Nasser stripped Amer of his command and appointed Chief of Staff Mohammed Fawzi in his place. The decision provoked an outcry among Amer's loyalists in the army, and in late August, Nasser confronted Amer for plotting against him. Despite Amer's denials, he and a group of 50 officers were arrested. While awaiting trial, Amer took poison and died on the 13th of September 1967. Despite the rivalry and hostility between Nasser and Amer, which resulted in the latter's tragic demise, Nasser continued to refer to the late commander as the person closest to me. Sentimental considerations aside, in early 1968, Nasser continued to purge the army of Amer's supporters and reorganized his cabinet by removing military officials and appointing civilians in their place. While Nasser promised further democratization and liberalization, he concentrated more power in his own hands than ever before. As Nasser consolidated his authority at home, the war with Israel was not officially over, and the Sinai remained under Israeli occupation. In late August 1967, Nasser attended the Arab League summit in the Sudanese capital of Khartoum, where he was overshadowed by King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. On the 1st of September, the leaders agreed to the Khartoum Resolution, which declared no peace with Israel, no negotiation with Israel, no recognition of Israel. Nasser also agreed to a ceasefire in the North Yemen civil war, which allowed him to withdraw his troops. In November, Nasser endorsed UN Security Council Resolution 242, which called for Israeli withdrawal from the territories occupied during the Six-Day War. The Soviet Union provided Nasser with military aid to help rebuild the Egyptian army. For the remainder of his presidency, Nasser aligned with the Communists against the United States in his foreign policy, and in January 1968, he allowed the Soviets to build 3 naval bases on Egyptian soil. In the meantime, the PLO and the Fatah movement, under the leadership of an emerging figure, Yasser Arafat, moved to the border town of Karame in Jordan and began to launch guerrilla raids across the river to the West Bank against Israel. On the 21st of March 1968, the Israelis attacked the Palestinians in force in an attempt to destroy the camps and capture Arafat. The Palestinians fought tenaciously at Karame and were later reinforced by the Jordanian army, forcing the Israelis to withdraw. The Israelis suffered heavy casualties, with almost 30 killed and around 70 wounded. Though the Palestinian dead numbered more than 100, the battle was a victory for the Arab forces and served to restore some of the wounded Arab pride following the disastrous defeat of the Six-Day War. Nasser was delighted with Fatah's success and invited him and the PLO leaders to Cairo. During the meeting, Nasser ceded the leadership of the Arab cause against Israel to Fatah, explaining that the Palestinians were freer to pursue the cause as they were not bound by UN resolutions. Nasser agreed to provide Arafat with as much military and financial aid as he required to liberate Palestine, but when the latter was unable to say how long it would take for him to do so, Nasser suggested a compromise peace with a Palestinian state made up of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the two-state solution. Israel had refused to give up its conquests from the Six-Day War, and in January 1968, Nasser began a war of attrition by attacking Israeli positions on the east bank of the Suez Canal in an attempt to retake the Sinai Peninsula. The Israelis retaliated by attacking Egyptian cities on the canal's west bank. These ongoing hostilities led to fears in both the United States and the Soviet Union that they would be drawn into the war, and in late 1969, the two superpowers began taking steps to persuade Egypt and Israel to end the border clashes before they escalated into a new full-blown war. US Secretary of State William Rogers developed a plan based on Resolution 242, which called for immediate ceasefire, while warning the Israelis that if they did not agree, then they could not be assured of further US support. Although Israel rejected the Rogers plan, Nasser accepted the plan in June 1970, and in August a ceasefire was agreed, with the Israelis remaining in place in Sinai. Nasser soon violated the agreement by moving Soviet surface-to-air missile systems to the west bank of the Suez Canal. While Nasser and King Hussein of Jordan supported the Rogers Plan, the PLO was opposed and considered it an act of betrayal on the part of the Egyptian leader. The Palestinians responded by undermining King Hussein's authority in Jordan. The most dramatic demonstration took place in early September 1970, when the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine organized the hijacking of 4 commercial aircraft and forced them to land at Dawson Field outside Amman. After evacuating the passengers, the PFLP blew up the planes and made demands for an exchange of Palestinian prisoners in Israel and Europe in return for the hostages from the planes. While Nasser managed to broker an agreement following the hijackings, on the 16th of September, the Jordanian army attacked the PLO in an attempt to eradicate the organization. The Syrians became involved further in the days that followed, and at this juncture, Nasser sent an Arab League delegation to persuade Arafat to accept a ceasefire. An emergency meeting of the Arab League in Cairo was convened by him for the 27th of September. In a fraught meeting, Hussein and Arafat hurled insults at each other, but eventually signed an agreement whereby the Jordanians regained control of key cities and Hussein agreed to appoint a Palestinian as prime minister. The tense meeting between the Arab leaders took a toll on Nasser's health. A heavy smoker throughout his adult life, who had been diagnosed with diabetes in his late 30s, Nasser had been ill for some time. His health further declined on the back of traumatic events, including the collapse of the Union with Syria, defeat in the 6 Days War, and his power struggle with Amer. Since 1967, he had suffered several heart attacks, although these were not made public. On the 28th of September 1970, hours after bidding farewell to the Emir of Kuwait, the last Arab leader to leave the Cairo conference, Nasser suffered a heart attack and was taken home, where he died that evening at the age of just 52. An estimated 5 million mourners turned out for his funeral in Cairo on the 1st of October 1970. Both King Hussein and Yasser Arafat, the two men who had quarreled so viciously days earlier, attended the funeral and wept openly. Nasser was succeeded as president by Anwar Sadat. As Speaker of the National Assembly for most of the 1960s, Sadat had not played a prominent role in Nasser's government, but he had been appointed vice president in December 1969, and after succeeding to the presidency, he remained in office until his assassination in October 1981. In 1973, Sadat launched the Yom Kippur War against Israel and regained an Egyptian foothold on the east bank of the Suez Canal, and following the Camp David Accords, brokered by US President Jimmy Carter in 1978, an Egyptian-Israeli treaty signed in 1979 recognized Egyptian sovereignty over the Sinai Peninsula. Gamal Abdel Nasser leaves a far-reaching legacy in Egypt and the wider Arab world. His political views, notably his pan-Arab nationalism, were born of the tumultuous period of Arab history in the 1920s and 1930s as the Arabs attempted to remove the British and French from the Middle East in the aftermath of the First World War. Out of this, he emerged as a leader of the Association of Free Officers, which overthrew the British-backed monarchy in Egypt in 1952. After securing full power in 1954, Nasser established himself as a unique leader of the age. He was deeply committed to pan-Arabism and also determined that Egypt would walk its own line in the Cold War, not allying closely with either the US or the Soviet Union. Instead, he adopted a more moderate form of socialism. His policies were successful to some extent, while the development of the Aswan Dam transformed Egypt's economy in many ways. Yet Nasser will ultimately be judged on his foreign policies. On the one hand, Nasser's decision to nationalize the Suez Canal and his staring down of Britain and France seems reasonable in retrospect, ending European interference in what was a sovereign state, while it has also guaranteed him a place in the annals of wider modern history, as African decolonization accelerated rapidly after Suez. But elsewhere, his initiatives were less successful. The United Arab Republic was short-lived. His interference in the North Yemen civil war in the 1960s was ill-judged, and his approach towards Israel left Egypt more insecure on its northeastern border when he died than when he seized power in the mid-1950s. Overall, there were both successes and failures to Nasser's rule, but there is no doubt he was one of the more substantial figures in modern Arab history. What do you think of Gamal Abdel Nasser? Was he one of the greatest political leaders in Arab history who struck a fatal blow to British and French colonial ambitions at Suez, or is this overshadowed by his poor political decisions in the 1960s? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.